The morning sun rose over the horizon, washing the wide expanse of farmland in a dull golden light, but the fields did not look alive. They looked weary, as though the earth itself shared in the grief of the woman who stood upon it. Her name was Clara May, and though she was young, no more than 25, her eyes carried shadows far older. Just weeks before, her husband, Thomas, had been buried on a hill behind the house, the simple wooden cross, at his grave a reminder of how fragile life on the frontier could be. Consumption had taken him swiftly, and though Clara had prayed with every ounce of strength in her soul, God had not granted her a miracle. Now she stood at the edge of the field with dirt on her hands and sweat already beginning to bead on her brow. The plow, heavy and unyielding, seemed almost mocking as it waited for her grip. She was a farmer's wife, but she had never been the one to guide the iron teeth through stubborn soil. That had always been Thomas's duty. He had been strong, broad-shouldered, with arms built from years of breaking ground and sowing seed. Clara had worked alongside him. Yes, but never like this, never as the one who bore the full weight of keeping their land alive. But grief has a strange way of hardening resolve. She could not sit idly while the farm rotted. If she failed, she would starve. If she gave up, Thomas's dream of turning these barren acres into a thriving homestead would be buried with him. With trembling hands, Clara wrapped her fingers around the wooden handles of the plow. The leather reins slapped against her shoulder as she called to the mule. Urging it forward, the blade bit into the earth, but Clara's arms shook almost instantly, the strain coursing through her body like fire. Sweat rolled down her temples. Her breath came ragged. Still, she pressed on, furrows carving into the soil. Though her progress was painfully slow, the neighbors had offered to help, of course. They had come by after the funeral with baskets of bread and jars of preserves, their kind eyes filled with pity. But Clara had refused them all. Pride and sorrow mixed into a stubborn knot inside her chest. This was her land, her husband's land, and she would not let anyone else carry the burden. She wanted to prove, to herself, to the world, perhaps even to Thomas's spirit, that she could stand on her own 2 feet. Yet as the hours dragged on, her body screamed in protest. Dirt smeared her face and blisters burned raw on her palms. The mule snorted, restless, as though mocking her weakness. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She could not cry, not now, not in front of the empty horizon. But the truth was as undeniable as the ache in her bones. She was breaking. The land was winning. And then, just as her legs buckled beneath her, she heard the sound of hooves on dry earth. Clara froze, her breath catching. She turned her head and saw him, a rider coming down the road, dust rising behind his horse. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes, a leather vest over his shirt, and boots worn from miles of travel. A lasso hung at his side, and though he looked every bit the cowboy, there was something in his posture that spoke not of arrogance, but of quiet strength. He reined in his horse at the edge of the field, watching her silently for a long moment. Clara straightened her shoulders, embarrassed by the sight she must have made, her dress stained with mud, her braid clinging to her sweaty neck, her hands trembling as they clutched the plow. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he finally said, his voice low and steady. Clara's jaw tightened. "It's my land, my work." The cowboy dismounted, his boots crunching against the dry soil as he approached. "Work like this'll break you in 2, he said simply. His eyes, dark beneath the brim of his hat, met hers with an honesty that unsettled her. "I don't need your help," Clara shot back, though her arms trembled even as she gripped the plow tighter. The cowboy studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he stepped beside her. His hands, broad, calloused, and strong, closed over the wooden handles. Gently but firmly, he eased her grip away. "You'll rest now," he said, his voice carrying a quiet finality. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Something in his tone, not harsh but steady, protective, struck through her pride like a hammer on glass. Her chest rose and fell as she backed away, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. The cowboy adjusted the plow with practiced ease, whistled softly to the mule, and in one powerful stride, drove the blade through the soil. The earth split beneath him as though it had been waiting for his hand all along. Clara stood frozen, dirt streaked on her face, watching this stranger take up the work her husband had once done. The rhythmic crunch of the blade, the steady pull of the mule, the strength in the cowboy's shoulders, it was as though time itself had shifted. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara felt the crushing weight on her chest ease, if only slightly. Her arms still ached, her heart still bled, but something inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was not as alone as she thought. And so began the story of a widow, a cowboy, and a plow that would change both their lives forever. The days that followed moved like the steady turning of seasons, though each was heavy with the weight of choices neither Clara nor the cowboy had asked for. After that morning when he had taken the plow from her hands, she told herself it was only a moment of weakness, only one day when exhaustion had beaten her. She thought she would send him away. That pride would rise back up and carry her through the long hours in the field. But when the sun rose the next morning, she found him already there, leading the mule with sure hands, cutting furrows through the stubborn ground as though he had been born to it. Clara had stood on the porch then, arms folded, her heart divided. Part of her wanted to rage at him, to demand he leave her land and never return. But another part, quieter, more fragile, watched with a trembling sense of relief. She hadn't asked for his help, but the truth was plain. The farm was alive again. Rows stretched straight and clean across the field, soil turned and ready for seed. The dream she and Thomas had planted together was no longer slipping away. She learned his name soon enough, Elias. He spoke it simply, without flourish, and said little else about himself. He was a man who let his actions tell his story, and in every furrow he carved into the earth, Clara saw a history she didn't yet know. His shoulders carried the weight of more than just the plow, though he never said what it was. Some nights, when the work was done and the last light of day bled into the horizon, she would see him pause at the fence line, staring westward as if listening for echoes only he could hear. Clara tried to keep her distance. She cooked meals alone, ate in silence, and retreated early to her small bed, clutching the quilt Thomas's mother had sewn. She told herself Elias was only a worker, a stranger passing through, that when the planting was done he would ride off into the endless sky and she would be left again with her grief. And yet slowly, pieces of her armor began to crack. One evening, as she knelt in the garden with dirt beneath her nails, Elias approached carrying a sack of seed. "The ground's ready," he said simply. She looked up at him, strands of her braid falling loose. And for a moment the silence between them was filled with more than words could carry. They planted together that night, side by side, their hands brushing in the soil as the stars unfolded overhead. For the first time since Thomas's passing, Clara did not feel the crushing loneliness that had haunted her, but with comfort came guilt. Each laugh that slipped unbidden from her lips, each flicker of warmth she felt when Elias met her eyes, was chased by a sharp ache of betrayal. How could she allow herself even a glimmer of joy when Thomas lay beneath the earth behind the house? How could she accept another man's strength when her vows had been spoken in front of God and the whole town? She buried the guilt deep, telling herself it was only gratitude, nothing more. Still, the farm flourished. With Elias at the plow and Clara tending to the smaller tasks, watering, weeding, gathering eggs, they began to see life return. Shoots of green pushed through the soil, fragile yet defiant, promising a harvest that Clara had once thought impossible. The neighbors noticed, too. They came by with curious eyes, whispering behind their hands. Some pitied her, some judged, but Clara lifted her chin and bore their looks in silence. It was not until the storm came that her feelings truly shifted. The sky darkened without warning one afternoon, rolling clouds swallowing the horizon as winds tore across the fields. Clara rushed to gather the chickens, her skirts whipping around her legs, while Elias fought to secure the barn doors. The storm hit with a fury that shook the earth, rain lashing sideways, lightning tearing jagged scars across the heavens. Clara stumbled, mud sucking at her boots, and for one terrifying moment, the wind nearly dragged her from her feet. But Elias was there, his arm circling her waist, pulling her close as he shielded her with his own body. They made it inside the barn, breathless and soaked to the bone. The roar of the storm a deafening wall outside. Clara's heart pounded, not only from fear but from the warmth of his hand still steady against her side. She looked up at him then, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and for the first time she saw not just a stranger, but a man who had chosen to stand beside her when the world raged against them. "Why are you here, Elias?" she whispered, her voice trembling with more than the storm. He met her gaze, his jaw tight. For a long time he said nothing. Then, with a quiet roughness that carried more truth than any oath, he answered, "Because you shouldn't have to carry this alone." The storm passed, but his words lingered. They worked in silence the next day, but Clara's mind spun with questions she dared not speak. She knew only this: the weight that had once crushed her heart felt lighter with him near. That night, as she stood on the porch staring at the stars, she whispered into the darkness, "Thomas, forgive me." Her grief had not vanished, nor had her love for the man she had lost. But in the shadow of her sorrow, something new had begun to grow, something fragile, uncertain, but undeniably alive. Like the first tender shoots breaking through the soil after a long winter, Clara felt the stirrings of hope. And hope, once planted, cannot easily be buried.